So do you have two or three key things that work for you from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, so the first thing is I'm always looking for what is the mission, what are we trying to achieve here, and why.
Great.
Now, sitting next to that is who's in control, because unless you understand who's in control, it's very hard to get everybody on board with the mission and have an understanding as to why we're trying to achieve this.
For sure.
So when I go into any particular business, I'm always inquisitive, have a high level of curiosity about what's this business about, what are we trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I love working for privately owned businesses. I'm a sucker for businesses that have great opportunity and potential.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Lead Well, Live Well. I've got a good friend and a great guy to join us today. As you know, we have authentic conversations with interesting leaders, and it'll be fascinating today to talk about supply chain. So my guest today is Peter Jones. He is the founder and managing director of Prological, who are supply chain consultants. Peter, great to have you here.
Thanks, Mark. It's good to
see
be
you.
here with you.
Yeah, I've always thought of supply chain as the boring part of the business. You know, like everyone's into the product and the marketing and the people and things like that. Do you think it's an area that's underestimated as far as its importance to business?
It's certainly underestimated in that the opportunity for businesses to build distinctive competency within their sector today more than ever before exists within supply chain. Now, part of that is because most other areas of businesses have been front and centre in their season and have now reached levels of maturity, whereas supply chain, particularly in the last 5 years, has really stepped up in terms of its profile within businesses. That sort of all started when we were complaining that there was no toilet paper in the supermarket, and supply chain became a topic at the dinner table. And that conversation has really transformed supply chain within the business world, and that's still accelerating.
It certainly changed after COVID, didn't it? I mean, I remember that people queues for toilet paper, and when they locked down Western Sydney, everybody worked out that actually that's where all the work was done.
Yeah, correct.
The rest of us were just making lattes for each other.
Yep. Which, being a logistician, I look back and I go, well, how well have we been doing our job? That's something so important, and we realised that importance during those early days of COVID.
Yeah.
But it's just happened, and nobody's even realised that it's happened. And so in part, it says that, supply chains have served our communities really well. But the transition going on now is for businesses to really up their game and draw on the opportunities that are available to really enhance their own business offering by making their supply chain into that distinctive competency that more than ever is possible to do.
Yeah, it's been in ascendancy. I mean, boardrooms, for instance, were never really that interested in supply chain. It was kind of the moving things around, the boring part of the business.
The back end of the business.
Exactly. Yeah. And yet with COVID and that move from just-in-time, single point of origin, lowest possible cost to the just-in-case where supply chains just got fractured and everyone's kind of thinking about it in a different way. Tell me about Australia and the impact on supply chain for us here, because we're quite a unique environment, aren't we?
We are. So, Sydney and Melbourne, despite the way in which we often look at Australia, are two of the biggest cities in the world. And if you go to Europe, there's only two cities bigger than them. And in North America, there's a few more than two, but not a lot more. And so we have international requirements, that rival any other nation between Sydney and Melbourne. Then we get to the rest of the country, and Brisbane sort of sits halfway between being at the pointy end of global benchmarks to being, a little bit more remote and small. But that uniqueness is we have these two huge cities with enormous trade happening between those two cities and a lot of movement every single day. And then on the other end of things, as we all know, it's a very big paddock. And Australia is the same size as the continental 48 states of North America. Yeah. The difference is about the size of the Illawarra at that level. So we've got this huge area and then no people in other places, yet those people live in Australia and they live to Australian standards, and to some level they have the same sorts of aspirations and expectations that we have when we live in proximity to Sydney and Melbourne. and that is, it's available and I want it now, and I'd like to have access to that. And to a large extent, Australian businesses do a really, really good job of fulfilling those expectations to the majority of Australians. And it's not difficult for businesses of large scale that have a consumer-facing supply chain to be able to get to 97, 98% of the population with an overnight delivery. So that network structure is well within the reach of large companies with that customer-facing. If you're a smaller company, the infrastructure required to meet that standard is probably a little bit out of reach. But we've done some exciting projects with some big brand companies where we've actually achieved those sorts of outcomes, and that's really that's exciting to figure out how to make that happen and then actually execute it so that it works. And at the same time, smaller companies, we do have transport options in Australia, which still make that same service offering possible from one point, be it Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane particularly. Now, that has a high transport cost, but pharmaceutical industry, medical industry, those sorts of industries access that sort of capability as well. And we've worked with vaccine companies and companies that are into very, very important medical products, and worked out all sorts of creative ways to get those into the middle of Northern Territory, to islands in the Gulf of Carpentaria, to far northwest Western Australia overnight out of Melbourne. And so those sorts of things are possible as well. So, but these are the things that make Australia unique. When you get to Europe and North America, you've got a lot of cities with 1 million people, not too far from each other. And so at that sort of level, for a lot of businesses, that 1 million people plus those that are in the regional area around them creates enough synergy for a lot of businesses to be able to put a hub in that location.
Different game, isn't it?
Yeah, different game. North America's a bit the same as well.
And you've just spent a bit of time overseas recently. What do you think are the biggest differences between, say, Europe and us? Are we lagging behind in some of the things that we're doing, the way we approach supply chain?
Yeah. Look, there's a few things that we're in front and a few things where we would do very, very well to go and learn more about what they're doing and leverage that. And if we can continue both of those things, continue to leverage that, which we're really good at, which is moving product long distances in very short timeframes. I don't think Canada is similar to Australia and is not dissimilar. 2 population centres around Montreal and Toronto on the east side or the central east, and then Vancouver and British Columbia on the west coast. So we've got Sydney, Melbourne. Ours are a bit closer together, but from a supply chain perspective, there's a lot of similarities. But
a little warmer here.
Yeah, that's correct. But from a European perspective, their rail infrastructure, which is now largely being driven by the environmental issues and carbon reduction.
Okay.
So this notion, which Australia's talked about for a while, is how do we get trucks off the road? How do we get more freight onto rail? And it's interesting, just 50 years ago, nearly 40% of consumer freight between Sydney and Melbourne was on the train. Right. Today, it's less than 2% nationally of consumer-based freight travels on train, and over 90% of that 2% is between the East Coast and the West Coast. So if you take Melbourne and Sydney to Perth out, it's almost zero.
So is there a move, do you think, to go back to rail?
There's absolutely a lot of talk about it. So in 2015, the federal government approved the Inland Rail project, and the ambition of that was to link Melbourne with Brisbane by a rail freight service that was comparable and competitive with road freight at both a cost and a service level. That ambition is absolutely achievable. The technology and engineering solutions required to deliver that are real and have maturity in Europe. But the challenge in Australia is the risk of making the capital expenditure to enable that, and then they don't come.
Yes.
And so it's almost like it has to be designed for success for the end customer in order to be successful.
And talking about maturity, there's obviously a political element with that, with working within a federation and different expectations from states and who controls what. There's not that many of us. It's a big piece of dirt.
Yes.
And yet we have all these dividing lines and different areas of authority and governance. That's got to play into this whole space around rail.
Well, it is a fascinating discussion, and still to this day, without the federal government exercising its right to have influence and even decision-making capability, because at the end of the day, they're stumping up the money for these sorts of projects.
Yep.
But the states left to their own, we've seen plenty of evidence over the last decade of still them doing what they think is best within their particular environment without the necessary collaboration to create a network which works very efficiently from beginning to end. And in Australia, we've got good form with this. So our electrical rail systems, the 3 East Coast cities all run different types of electrical rail systems, different voltages, different amperages.
It's crazy.
We've got 3 different gauges between what happens in the 3 eastern capital cities in terms of the rail width. There was once a great debate when Australia was looking at putting rail in the late 1800s. Should we evolve the tram technology that already existed in Melbourne, or should we follow the heavy rail example that was gaining maturity in England and getting traction in North America? Now, thankfully, the heavy rail element prevailed in terms of developing regional and then interstate train networks. But our states have not got a good track record in collaboration on these sorts of projects. The rail projects going on at the moment, the National Intermodal Company, which was set up as a economic commercial arm of the Department of Infrastructure and Planning, they're doing a pretty good job now of harnessing the collaboration that's required between the states and moving things in a good direction. But it's taken a while for that to play through.
And you're involved in the middle of that, aren't you, with some level of expertise around?
Yeah, we've been involved in quite a few of the pieces of work, both in Victoria and Queensland, mainly around where terminals ought to go, and that's brought us into the fray of the broader agenda that has played out and how that has evolved over time and the direction that it's moving in at this stage. Yeah. None of us should be surprised that it's running a little bit over budget and it's running a little bit behind time frame.
Surprise.
But so was the Opera House, and we wouldn't do without that. So my encouragement is, yes, it's going to cost more. Yes, it's going to take longer, but it will deliver in spades if we deliver correctly. And therefore, I'm really encouraging, let's stay the course.
Nice.
But use the time we've got to get it right.
Well, it's good to know there's some sane practical advice going into that area. You operate in a lot of different industries. Glass, cars, parts, a whole bunch of different areas, and then the infrastructure side of things. What are your customers asking for at the moment? What are they wrestling with? What are most of the solutions that you're putting in? What do they look like at the moment?
Yeah, look, this has really moved in the last few years, last 5 years, I would say. So pre-COVID, there was the beginning of movement occurring. And I guess it's technology and automation that started to lead those two elements in terms of enablers. Then COVID happened, and the just-in-time principles that Toyota developed with their manufacturing process, fantastic. Lots of businesses copied in manufacturing. But then it actually came into supply chain globally in spades during the GFC. So businesses just, there was no cash around. And so from the finance teams within businesses globally just pulled inventory out. And during the global financial crisis, there was lower demand as well on supply. And so that created the space for businesses to work out how to run with much leaner inventory.
Yep.
So when we came out of that, we'd shifted paradigm. And so we ran with that lean inventory, which was all around just-in-time manufacturing principles being applied to supply chain fulfillment. So that worked really, really well while we had a perfect world and everything worked as it did. But it became a very, very fragile house of cards during COVID. And as soon as the supply chain nodes started to fail, air freight, shipping, ports started to fail, that just-in-time thing, businesses fell off a cliff, some within weeks because of the fragility of the supply chain they'd come to rely on.
Yeah.
So they're the two things that have really driven the change. And so out of all of that, businesses are now looking to see how do I leverage my supply chain in order to help drive my business's strategy. So no longer is it seen as that bit on the end, just how hard can it be to get it off the shelf and put it on a truck, send it to the customer. That's an oversimplified but a colloquial view of how supply chain has been seen from executive level in the past to today, seeing it. This is an area that if I invest wisely in, I can actually increase profitability, I can increase market share, I can super please my customer and therefore keep that customer.
So it's an area of competitive advantage now if you're ahead of that curve.
Absolutely,
Because Amazon have been playing on this for a while, particularly in the US. And you did some work with the Iconic as well, didn't you? So
Yeah, that's
you're
correct.
familiar with the online space. So if people aren't keeping up with the expectation of consumers, ultimately they'll fall behind.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that you mentioned Amazon and the Iconic as two examples. And the Iconic in Australia is seen as the benchmark of order fulfillment within the business to consumer or B2C world.
Yeah.
So even Amazon in Australia looks to the Iconic and says, what are they doing? How do we emulate that? And Amazon's doing a fantastic job of doing that. It's not that, one is miles in front of the other, but the Iconic as an Australian business has set world benchmarks in terms of what it's able to achieve in that level. Customers
Purely down to your advice, of course.
Look, I really enjoyed working with Erica Berchtold when she was the CEO there, and what I loved most was she was already running a good business, they were doing a great job, and in the years leading into and during COVID, kicking it out of the ballpark, and so that happened under her watch in that particular business, and at the same time though she brought in an external consulting firm. And as it were, it was to go from good to great was the ambition. And, and that's a fantastic ambition for a CEO to have. We're doing well, so how do we do better and get the expertise in? And we were able to help out in a couple of very significant ways. Their growth had created challenges for them in their warehouse. And so sorting all of that out was good. We were able to set for them a medium long-term strategy, which is still on the table because of COVID and the slowdown in things. The timetable of that has slipped, but they now have clarity around what they need to do in the medium and longer term. So that was really good. But coming back to your question about the expectation change, it's the Amazons and the Iconics of the world that are changing the business-to-business supply chain expectation and the customer in that environment as well. Because, for example, the CFO of a chemical manufacturing company goes home at night, gets online, gets onto the super retail group, boating, camping and fishing, for example, orders what they want. They've got all sorts of information that comes back to them instantly. And over the next 48 hours, they'll get communicated with well, and then things turn up exactly as it's supposed to happen in their B2C engagement. And then that same CFO goes into the C-suite meeting, weekly meeting, and there's problems with service delivery to the customers of the chemical company for which he works for. And so the CFO is there sitting there thinking, but last week I had this experience with boating, camping and fishing, or, whatever company it may have been. And this is what happened. That B2C capability they've got, they've only been doing that for 5 years. We've been here for 30 years, and yet we're nowhere near providing that level of visibility, service, et cetera, to our customers. How can that be?
Yeah.
Now, the disruptor always has the advantage because the disruptor, everything is new. So they're starting with whatever is the latest and the greatest as their baseline, whereas the more mature company has got legacy systems, they've got investment, which they're still trying to leverage and get back out of it, what the business case when they put those things into place. So the mature business have always got that challenge of dealing with the legacy, and the disruptor has always got the advantage of latest and greatest as their starting position. From the customer's perspective, though, that story doesn't cut any relevance. No. The customer just knows, I want to do A and my expectation is B, and all of these people can do it. And so that expectation of what the B2C world has evolved in our thinking, there's enough people now in the C-suite all saying, I had this experience with my B2C. Why can't our B2B business do that? What do we need to do to make that happen? Yeah. So that's one of the things that's changed. And then at the same time, enablers to prosecute that case have become more accessible. And automation and technology are the two big changes that have occurred there. Yeah. Technology's been evolving progressively for better than a decade. Sure. But automation has really kicked in the last 5 years and becoming rapidly more accessible to more and more businesses, and that acceleration has not finished yet.
No, we're going to see a lot more of that, aren't we? We had Byron Patching, Byron Patching from
from Mushy,
from Shiny, yes.
Yep.
He's the robot guy, as we know. So what's your view on, because obviously machine learning is becoming more important, systems become, and transparency, I mean, to drive the transparency you're talking about, you need great IT systems and used in the right way. So what's your take on machine learning, AI? Because I think AI it's a bit overused as a term. So probably in this environment, it's more about machine learning. But machine learning, AI, and robots, that combination of technologies, big disruptors. Like, what's your take on that?
So I'll start with the simpler one for us to more easily get our head around, and that's automation and robots within the warehouse. So absolute winners, even in smaller environments, 5 and 10,000 square metre warehouses, there's a place now for some level of automation. So the business case will depend on your legacy situation and your ability to be able to access the technology within a business case. And that will depend on, things like, are you looking for, have you got to have everything on a 12-month ROI, or can you go to a 3-year ROI or a 6-year ROI? So they're the elements that will dictate how much you can lean into the space of automation and how much automation you can actually leverage. But for most businesses today, there's very few that would not be benefiting from some level of automation. The question then is how much and what application and what automation do you apply? The challenge for the buyers today is that some of the best salespeople in the world work for these automation companies.
Right.
They're very good at selling what they have, but there is an enormous array of automation available. So it's a bit like saying, I want a car. So do you want a Mazda 2 because you want to run around the CBD and parking and no petrol, or have you got 7 kids? So, so depending on your answer to those two questions, examples, as to what sort of car you go and get, the world of automation is that on steroids in terms of the complexity and the ability of different systems, capacity to deliver what a particular business will need.
Yeah.
But
so that's where you come in. You're in on that interface of helping people understand what's available and how to implement it.
And what's going to be best for their particular scenario. Okay. And that's not about today only. Yeah. You've got to be looking into the future. And this is another one of the big changes that has occurred. Businesses during the GFC to COVID window, let's call that the lean window, and the JIT period of time, got used to very short lead times as well on their ROIs that got approved at the C-suite and at board levels. To get into the world of automation requires a rethink on that. In order to be able to engage in that rethink, you also need to have a much better handle on what your business is going to look like over a longer period of time.
Right.
So to get really high, you can easily spend $100 million on automation within a 25,000 square metre warehouse. So, that's a big warehouse, but there's lots of those around. So you could easily spend $100 million on the automation in that particular facility. The benefit of that automation is your OPEX costs and your ability to turn orders around and control your inventory escalates enormously versus traditional processes and having people on the ground. The other side to it is, though, that $100 million, you cannot get that back in 3 years. You can fairly readily get a business case most times up in 10, but then you offset that with the opportunity it provides the business with a much lower OPEX, much higher inventory control, and much better service levels. So it also provides you the opportunity to build that distinctive competency. So the equation about how we invest in supply chain has become much more complicated.
For sure.
And this is part of what's also driven it now into the C-suite and the boardroom.
Yeah, because that becomes a very strategic conversation
Correct.
As opposed to reactionary.
As against a tactical one.
Large capital investment, but obviously as more and more of your competitors in any particular competitor set adopt this kind of thinking, if you don't adopt it, you die. You've got to embrace what's going to kill you.
Yes.
And there's first mover advantage, but it usually costs more. It doesn't work quite as well. Like there's some, I think we're still in an evolution phase of the adoption of these kind of things. And you talk about 100 million, like that's off the charts for most sort of medium-sized businesses. You're talking sort of large corporates. So I presume there's incremental.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And smaller business, a 5,000 square metre warehouse to invest $200,000 or $300,000
Yeah.
in some automation on receiving, palletising, using auto-guided vehicles to support put away and then to support the post-picking, but the long-distance movements back up to your outbound dock. A couple of $100,000 can get you a lot of value there, and your offsets are a few people and a few forklifts, as well as a totally different way you'll think about the way your operation works, and out of that in itself will come some operational benefit. So so that's a good pickup. For small businesses, 5,000 square metres, a couple of $100,000, strong ROI on that sort of investment, and the couple of $100,000 can be OPEX'd as well. It doesn't have to be CapEx'd.
So what sort of resistance do you get? Because I think it's an interesting area where people tend to think about technology or being used to help them do what they do currently better. But I think there's now dislocating technologies, which actually flips you into a whole different model where you have to completely rethink how you do everything. Is there a resistance point there? Do people recognize that you're going to have to change everything in order to be able to go to the next step rather than just improve what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really insightful pickup. So I'll start with the only people in the world that like change are wet babies.
Right.
For the rest of us, it's hard work.
It is.
So when you look at introducing automation into warehouses, you've totally shifted from giving instructions to people to having IT at the centre, or at least taking a much more significant seat at the execution table. But those IT people are not your traditional warehouse people. They're tertiary educated and they've got aspirations for their life as well. And yet we're integrating those into a world which has been culturally very, very different to that. So that in the first instance is a big change. The second thing is the actual people that work in the warehouse are used to operating in certain sorts of ways. And now there's all of these things happening that they can't see because we've got molecules running around in the air talking from a black box inside the offices to a black box that's hiding in this thing that's running around the warehouse by itself doing things, and I don't even know what it's doing. So that's another change. There's also the fear of what will happen to me. What is my place in this? And that's a really important thing for businesses to wrestle with. And part of how we're seeing this is there is opportunity for businesses to grow market share and therefore expand and therefore redeploy those resources. We're never going to get away from needing people. And so where automation in the warehouses are changing is that the medial repetitive tasks are the things that are being repeated. But you've still got to have people working in the warehouse doing lots of things, and that will, nobody's foreseeing totally peopleless warehouse environments from receiving to dispatch. That's not going to happen. But there is a people issue there. And then when you get people working within these environments, the tasks have changed as well. So previously, and we saw this in a couple of places that we have worked, where when you're in a traditional environment, people are interacting with each other and people are moving around and they're walking and they're reaching and bending and all of those sorts of things all day long. When you get into automated environments, people are much more static because they're on the end of whatever the automation is doing. So two things have happened there. One is their physical environment has changed. So we absolutely have got to give consideration to that because it is not good for people to be doing the same things all day, every day. And the smart places that are introducing automation have a cadence within their facility where people are moving from one task to another task every 30 minutes, every 60 minutes, so that they're doing something quite different in a different environment. So that sort of thinking needs to come. The second thing is the traditional warehouse environment is a reasonably social environment, and automation is limiting that because a person is now more often than not standing in one place or a small area and more often than not working on their own, as against in the traditional world, walking up and down aisleways, three of my colleagues are here, and you're
social.
Yeah, it's quite a social environment. So these are changes and they're very significant and they need to be considered from the get-go. The cultural change element within businesses that embrace automation is equally as important as the technology pathway that they're going on as well. And it's far too easy to get excited about the technology pathway for the C-suite and the board to be most interested about that because that's what they've written the check for.
Yeah.
But the people side of this is equally important, very important.
Any of these big implementations, there's always a massive change process that needs to be taken into consideration.
So I go back to that wet baby thing.
Wet babies.
Just consider that. For everyone else, it's hard work. So
right.
we need to have empathy to that reality.
Everybody loves change unless it impacts them. Yeah, right. Can we just pivot the conversation a little bit too? Because it'd be nice to hear a little bit about your own leadership journey. You know, you've built this business. You're in and around a lot of big companies. You know, you built a team. You have a lot of consultants working for you and deployed around the place, even in New Zealand and other places. What about your own leadership lessons and your own leadership journey? Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things that are important for you about leadership?
Look, the way in which I talk about this is continually evolving, but I think the story has sort of stayed the same underneath that. For whatever reason, for most of my life, when I've done things, other people have followed. Right. And I've then found myself not too often following other people. So when I was young, I didn't really understand that was what was going on. But as I got older and reflected, I could see that is what happened. You know, even when I was back in high school, I liked snow skiing. We didn't have much money, so I went and organised my own ski trips, rounded up a heap of people to go, would make a few $100s out of one trip, and that would pay for me to go for 3 or 4 other trips. And then I'd run another one, and so it went on. And that started in year 9 in high school. Now, looking back, I can see that was leadership being exercised. It was entrepreneurial. I had a problem. I found a solution, and I got on with it. So at another level, still to this day, that same sort of thing is happening. So there's that notion of, on reflection, find people following me for whatever reason.
So a natural talent, because we're all built uniquely. And I think, you know, there's a bit of a myth in leadership circles that anybody can be a leader. And I think anyone can improve their leadership. But if you've got a natural talent and you're built for leadership, I think there is an advantage in that. So if you're kind of born a 6, you can get to a 9. If you're born a 2 or a 3 in this area, you've got skills in other areas, you can develop to a 4 and a 5. So I think there's a bit of a myth. We can grow our leadership, but some of us have an innate leadership talent, I think.
Yeah, and I think that is true. And then on top of that, I guess I've had a leadership development journey. And that's been enhanced through some of the vocations that I've had, some of the circumstances that occurred through life. And I went to theological college. For a while I was an Anglican church pastor. So there was an opportunity to exercise leadership through that particular journey.
There's a leadership challenge right there.
And that absolutely. And in a funny sort of way, that world prepared me really well for supply chain, which, and whilst we've talked about automation and technology and all of those things, at the end of the day, it's a people business. People make things happen, not machines. And that will always be the case. So, so that journey of being a pastor for 11 or 12 years was also really good preparation for where I am now. And then I was very fortunate to bump into an American guy who came to Australia to do a PhD in leadership development, and he had this process called the Authentic Action Wheel, and it's very much an ethical-based and a logic-based leadership process, and it very clearly delineates between what our management tasks are and what our leadership tasks are when you're in that positional leadership role. So what we quite often find is people get the positional leadership role, but they still operate in the management tasks rather than the leadership ones. And so so this paradigm that I learned through Dr. Ron Holkren has been quite foundational to me, then having a language and a model through which I could then come to better understand the way I was wired up and how to exercise that.
So do you have 2 or 3 key things that work for you from a leadership perspective?
Yeah, so the first thing is I'm always looking for what is the mission, what are we trying to achieve here, and why.
Great.
Now, sitting next to that is who's in control, because unless you understand who's in control, it's very hard to get everybody on board with the mission and have an understanding as to why we're trying to achieve this.
For sure.
So when I go into any particular business, I'm always inquisitive, have a high level of curiosity about what's this business about, what are we trying to achieve. And for that reason, I love working for privately owned businesses. I'm a sucker for businesses that have great opportunity and potential. Their success has become their liability in this moment, and they need a hand to get across a bridge in order to get to the next stage.
So that's step change. For
Yeah,
scale.
step change.
Nice.
So I become a sucker for getting involved in those.
They're fun.
Yeah, but they're fun because I can make a difference there. And so you get on board with private business. The mission is clear, as a person and their family, all of these staff, people that they now love and care for, and they're all relying on this business being successful.
Yeah.
So I like getting involved in those sorts of things. I really struggle getting involved in businesses where the objective is a couple of directors are not happy with their bonus they're getting at the end of the year.
Right.
I find that a really difficult why to get involved in.
Sure.
So one of my things around that is, can I understand the mission of this business from the C-suite in a way that I can go down and tell that story to the forklift driver, and the forklift driver is inspired to do a better job because he understands the mission.
Love it.
So that's the paradigm I'm always sort of looking for. And as I say, where the mission has a strong set of value propositions behind it that have a high level of altruism within them, then it becomes very, very easy to go and get the people in the warehouse engaged in that sort of mission, because those same things will translate across to them.
Yeah.
So I really enjoy
a sense of
that.
vision, direction. And we all want to be part of something that's bigger than ourselves.
Yep.
And understanding the why behind the what just makes a big difference. That's great.
And then the other element, which I'm still and have been wrestling with for years, and only about a year ago got language for, was that notion of honouring the legacy that I've been left. Smart people made the decisions that were involved in wherever we are today.
Yep.
Maybe it wasn't so smart people that left those decisions in place for as long as they've been left in place. That might be the problem.
Yep.
But they were probably smart people making the best decisions they could at some point in time. And I'm in the room today because of that legacy, and we've got an opportunity for the future. So the first thing is honour the legacy I've been left.
Love it.
The second one then is build a legacy worth honouring.
Great.
So that's what I want to leave.
Yep.
So that allows me to come to where I am with curiosity and humility.
Yeah.
And people generally respond more positively to those than a know-it-all that's got all of the answers.
That's a great way to look at it.
And then at the same time, I actually want to build something that hopefully somebody who's generous in the future sees that what we did in our season is also worthy of honouring. And so from that, I also take the phrase that I'm always wanting to take the posture of standing on the shoulders of greatness. There was greatness here before me. I'm standing on their shoulders now.
Yep.
And that's taken us to a higher place. And what I hope is that people in the future will look back on what we left and they will be able to stand on our shoulders at an even higher level.
That's a refreshing perspective, because often when people come in, either take over from a previous leader or doing what you're doing, coming into a company and looking at some of the issues, it's very easy just to bag the past or the status quo. But you're quite right. Those are the things that are there because there was a problem. Someone put up a solution in place, which was probably very appropriate and smart for its time.
At that time.
And then can you put in something that is going to leave a legacy for the next, and you're just sort of handing it off to the next generation or the next iteration. I think that's a very healthy way to look at it. We have a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs and business leaders in various stages. Do you have any words of advice and wisdom? You've been around the block, Peter, a couple of times, like I have. You've done some leadership things. Any advice for people that are wrestling with how to lead?
It's a great thing. I find, that's an objective comment that might apply to all. I have found it really refreshing and invigorating most days to know that I can get out of bed and make a difference to the life of other people and to my team and to myself. And being an entrepreneur and running my own business affords me that opportunity.
Yes.
So I really like that. And over my 27, 28 years doing what I'm doing now, and I've working career that's more than 40 years old, I can look back and I've got some really good stories, and I can look at some businesses, some brands, and lots of people, and know that in some small way they've got a better tomorrow because our paths crossed yesterday.
Yeah.
And so as the entrepreneur and the leader of a business, I have that opportunity. That's a wonderful thing to have.
It is.
With that comes some responsibilities.
Yeah.
And not every day is a great day.
That is true.
So I've been in, business on my own at one level or another since 2002. So we started in a mini recession, and that was a difficult start, and finances were very tight. And then things came good, and then we got into the GFC. And the GFC, we went for 6 months without getting any new work. And so as an owner of a business, you don't get paid, mortgages come under threat and risk, and children at school and all of those sorts of things. And so you've got to wrestle your way through those. Now, being, from my perspective, blessed with some leadership capability and some fairly thick skin, and being an entrepreneur, most of the time we can find our way through those sorts of things. Important to that is to just remember, I've been here before, and last time it was okay. We actually came out the other end.
I like that.
It's about surviving enough of those cycles to then lower the stress levels when it turns up next time.
Yeah.
Because that's what actually allows you to get out of bed again tomorrow and have another crack at either solving the problem that you've got right now, or conversely, progressing things to the next level and fulfilling the ambition and aspiration that is before you.
I like that.
Now, most days it's about getting out of bed and fulfilling the aspiration and ambition, but there's also those other seasons where it's about, how do I survive? My back is against the wall. I don't see the way forward. I've got no idea how we're going to work through this. But to wake up with that belief to know, but I've been here before, I've not seen the direction to go before. I've just got out of bed and worked with what I have in my hands and worked towards that which is before me, one step at a time. And for 40 years, that's worked okay. So I'm not changing strategy now.
Yep.
Doesn't mean the stress isn't there in the difficult times, nor does it diminish the blessing of the really good times. But so know the journey.
Yeah.
That's what the journey is like. There's I find a great thing in getting out of bed, knowing that I can make a difference to all of the people within my sphere and the businesses in my sphere each day.
I love that.
That's what I really enjoy.
That's great. And some resilience required.
Absolutely, resilience is required. But if it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
That is true. That is true. I think that's probably a wonderful point to leave that. Peter, if people are interested in connecting with you, what's the best, your website, prological.com.au, is that the best website?
Prologicalconsulting.com, prological.com.au will also work. Yes, that works. Jump on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. You could even nowadays just Google my name.
Yeah.
And
every time I jump on LinkedIn, I'm looking at your face.
You'll find me.
You're spamming the world. Peter Jones, what a wonderful conversation. Great to spend some time with you. Turns out supply chain's not that boring after all.
Mark, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
You're welcome. Good to see you. Thanks for joining us on another episode from the Lead Well, Live Well podcast. Thanks for your company. Please like and subscribe. It really helps support the channel if you do that. If you're a business leader and you have an interest in strategy and culture and leadership, then please join us at our website at leadwelllivewell.com. All those links will be in the description below. Until next time, thanks for watching.